Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you and welcome to this Common Awards webinar on Rethinking Mission and Evangelism. Thank you so much for joining us for this conversation in which we're going to be exploring post-colonial, contextual and global church perspectives on mission and evangelism. It's so great to see so many of you on this call. My name is Chinny MacDonald and I'm a writer, broadcaster and public theologian, and my day job is Head of Public Engagement at Christian Aid, the International Development Agency. I'm joined this afternoon by two brilliant speakers, Dr. Kathy Ross and Reverend Dr. Anderson Jeremiah. I'll introduce them now by reading their bios. Dr. Kathy Ross is a leading missiologist, contextual theologian and head of pioneer mission leadership training at the Church Mission Society. Originally from New Zealand, Kathy began serving as a mission partner in 1991 with New Zealand's CMS in what was then Zaire. In 2005, she moved to the UK with her family to lead CMS's mission exchange and scholarship programs. Now, she's held a number of different interesting, fascinating positions at the Bible College of New Zealand, the Crowther Centre for Mission Education, Regent's Park College in Oxford, and the London School of Theology. Kathy is also a writer. Her published works include Women with a Mission, Mission in the 21st Century, and Pioneering Spirituality. She's also canon theologian for Leicester Cathedral in her spare time. And Reverend Dr. Anderson Jeremiah will be joining Dr. Kathy Ross. He is a theologian and lecturer in world Christianity at Lancaster University. Anderson holds a PhD degree from New College, the University of Edinburgh, and is an ordained Anglican priest. His research primarily centres on the study of contemporary Christianity and the socio-cultural implications of the shift of Christianity to the global south. His areas of academic expertise include a lot of different things, but I'll name a few of them. Christian theology in Asia, post-colonial approaches to theology, the Anglican Communion, Dalit studies, biblical hermeneutics, religious fundamentalism and politics, religious pluralism, politics and society in India, and much, much more. We're also joined this afternoon by Rachel Murray as our BSL interpreter. And just to give a warning that about halfway through, about 2:30, I have set my alarm. We're going to take a 2-minute break so that we can have a comfort break, but also to give Rachel a break. So we're going to have a conversation between Anderson and Kathy, and then we'll have a time of Q&A as well, which I might weave through if there are questions that come in from you. You may send me questions directly using the Zoom chat function, or if you want to post them in the open chat, if you could just write in block capitals question so that I know that it's a question. Also invite you to reflect in the chat as well. So here we go. I'm going to start with a question first to Anderson, if that's okay to kick us off. How is our understanding of mission impacted by our context?
Thank you, Chinny, and for the Common Award for organizing something fantastic. And it's very good to see that so many of us are engaging with this issue. Let me start with the expression. I think we use the terminology mission so much for several different contexts, and very often we mean different things. Let me start with my own definition of what I mean by mission within the Christian context. So for me, mission is first and foremost living the gospel of Christ. So the most important part of that living the gospel is the living element of that sentence. It's very easy for us, having inherited Christianity for the past 2,000 years, it's very easy to keep talking about the gospel, but it's a whole lot of different thing to say living the gospel. So for me, I think when we start exploring the living element of it, then where we are living, how we are living, and various aspects that shapes our living becomes very important. Therefore, gospel is essential, but at the same time, the living element becomes a very important component of how we translate that very aspect of gospel. So that kind of embodied living of the gospel that Christ has left to us is broadly can be understood as mission. And that opens up a lot of questions of examination and clarification, because it all differs from each individual to individual.
Thank you for that. We can come back to that, I'm sure. I wonder, Kathy, your reflections on whether mission is on mission and context.
Thanks, Janae, and good afternoon, everyone. Great to see so many people here. And thanks, Anderson. I love that idea of living out the gospel. I mean, I absolutely agree with that. And I guess the question, how is your understanding of mission impacted by context? I think for me, it very much is rooted in the incarnation, because the incarnation shows us that Jesus was rooted and embedded in a particular context. And that's actually what gives us the permission and the impetus to root our understanding of mission in our own contexts. Some of you know I've done some research recently on John Taylor, who is a great missiologist, former General Secretary of CMS, Church Mission Society. And he is the one actually that came up with the definition of mission, which is sometimes attributed to Rowan Williams, but it was originally John Taylor back in 1974, that mission is about finding out what God is doing and joining in. And I love that definition because firstly, it decenters us. It's all about God. It assumes that God and God's Spirit is already present, which of course God is. You know, it wasn't like the missionaries took God to Africa. God is already there. So God's Spirit is present in a particular place and context. God is at work. And it's up to us to, of course, the $64 million question is to find out what God is doing and how to join in with God's Spirit, who's already at work in a particular context. So that's my understanding of how mission is impacted by context. There is, in a sense, Steve Bevins, who's a great theologian, said there's no such thing as theology, there is only contextual theology. So everything is very much rooted, embedded in, and influenced by context.
Thank you. Those are really helpful explanations. I heard in both of your comments this idea of kind of a fluid, living, changing mission. And I wonder, just thinking about the kind of what others might say, is there any element, therefore, of mission which is unchangeable and which is static? And if so, what is that? Anderson.
For me, I think mission, as you very rightly captured, I think it is a very dynamic process. And Kathy has very beautifully articulated God almost emptying God's self into the humanity. And in essence, what that means is that this continuous process of self-emptying of God and what we associate with God, the characteristics of God, the very essence of God, manifested in the person of Jesus Christ, is an ever-flowing process. And so what I think we get into a lot of difficulty the moment we consolidate it, we put that in a box, and we say, this is what mission is. But at the same time, there are two distinctions I would make, and it's if we use the metaphor of a river or a stream that is flowing, the nature of the stream, the essence is the water. You know, that quality doesn't change. But if you take a long river that is flowing, it actually changes into different shapes. There could be waterfalls, there could be a small stream, but it can also be a massive lake that it flows into. So it takes different forms, and also in the process, you know, it evaporates, it rains. And so that metaphor for me is that the core calling, that's why I started off with the definition of gospel being at the core, at the heart of our mission, but how we deliver it, how it is landing in different parts and different places takes its own manifestation. But at the same time, we should be very careful not to kind of essentialize, this is how it needs to be delivered across the world. And as very beautifully Kathy said, it's not that the missionaries brought God to Africa or God to India or anywhere. God was there. We probably kind of discovered each other. Probably missionaries found in the presence of someone else who's not like them, they found the presence of God in that place. And so I think we need to keep that tension. We need to keep that tension between our desire to essentialize and also God's desire to let go and liberate everything constantly.
Thank you. That's brilliant. Kathy, any further reflections?
I think I just endorse all that. I mean, I guess I don't really like the phrase static because it just implies stillness, a kind of full stop in a box. And I mean, we might want to say that the gospel has universal truths and application, but they're going to be worked out in very different ways. And that's where I think, rather than kind of idea of stasis, we need the idea of imagination and flexibility and how we communicate those gospel truths and the reality of Jesus in very many different contexts. I think it's just another way of saying what Anderson said.
Thank you. Glad you're in agreement. Kathy, I'm going to stick with you for this next question. We've touched a little bit on, I guess, colonialism and the idea of the gospel or mission and what it looks like in contexts that are not a Western context. So I want to talk about post-colonial mission. What do we mean by that term, post-colonial mission, and how does this affect contemporary understandings of evangelism?
Oh, it's such a big question. So obviously post-colonialism means after colonialism. So that's already quite a big presupposition, I suppose, and we could have a big discussion about that as to whether we even are after colonialism. But I guess essentially it's linked to living with and owning that heritage of colonialism. And obviously that's going to be different for what you see depends on where you stand. So I imagine Anderson has a very different understanding of that as a Dalit Christian from me as a white Pākehā, is a word we use in New Zealand, a white Pākehā woman from New Zealand. But in terms of mission, it's understanding that, I think it's understanding, acknowledging, owning, articulating the ambiguity between mission and colonialism or mission and empire, which I think we might be coming on to, and all the difficulties that has meant, the misunderstandings that has created, unequal power relations and discourses, understandings, for example, just to pick one example that I heard last Saturday, which I think, Anderson, you'll resonate with very much, the white man's burden. So last Saturday, just to give you one example, I attended online the Uncomfortable Oxford tour, which is really great. I recommend them. Anyone can attend them online. Some postdoc students in Oxford taking you around Oxford and showing you the other side of Oxford, so the other side of the Dreaming Spires. And one of the things they talked about was the Indian Institute, which was founded in 1883, founded for Indian students to be a home for Indian students because the colleges did not want to take Indian students. So all these implications of race, racism, colonialism, power, and what that has done in mission. Another example from Congo, from Zaire, Emmanuel Katongole, very good Ugandan theologian, wonders, why is Congo such a mess? Why is it so difficult when it's been such a Christian country? And to cut a very long argument short, he talks about same script, different actors. It's almost like mimicry. What colonialism, King Leopold, the Belgians, and this course is replicated right throughout colonial Africa and elsewhere. They introduced a particular script, a particular colonial script, and that's been mimicked and replicated partly because of the colonization of the imagination, I guess. This is such a big question, but those are some hooks maybe. Anderson, I'd be interested to hear how you would respond to that question.
Over to you, Anderson.
Yeah, Obviously, yeah. This is again just to plug in the. I'm sure Kathy will do that. I think there's this great resource that has come out of CMS Anvil, the journal that really captures many of these questions in terms of the post-colonial element of it. Let me just speak from my experience. I think this is what why post-colonialism is very important. I grew up in Church of South India, which itself is an amalgamation of several different denominations that has come together after centuries of Christian mission in India. But not until actually I began exploring some of the serious questions during my doctoral research, I did not realize many of the things that I've been practicing, that I've been told to do as a Christian, was very much taught to me by my elders, who have been taught in return by the early missionaries. So what in many contexts, even today, in many parts of Asia, in Africa, and in South America, many Christians still do what missionaries taught them to do, not realizing that this is whatever they are trying to do is quite contrary to their own cultural practice. Here, this is where post-colonialism becomes a real issue. It's not a conceptual, theoretical issue, but it's something that goes into the very heart of who we are as people. Because until I realized for a long time, and whenever I went home after this moment of enlightenment, is that to what extent I was alienated in my own context. Because of my colonial heritage, because of the Christianity that I was given, I was alienating myself every day, in every moment. What post-colonialism does in this context is to enable oneself to question our very understanding of who we are, our faith and our belief and our practice, what kind of Christianity, what kind of faith in this Christ that we proclaim within this local context. All these questions are deeply entangled in centuries of colonial history. So, I'll conclude with just one example, how we are kind of geographically kind of imprisoned in this framing is that if you ever travel to South India, I always tell this to people, if you ever travel to India, there's this place called Tranquebar. That's where the first Protestant missionary landed. Ziegenbalg, a Lutheran missionary who landed. And he built one of the first churches, Protestant churches in Tranquebar, and it's still there. It is built in the shape of a cross. It's called the New Jerusalem Church. It is very interesting because he used the different arms of the cross-shaped church to house different caste groups of people so that they don't mingle with each other. And there was even screens that would come up in this church. This is a church that is built in the shape of a cross, but used for a very different purpose. And that still exists even today in 2020. You can see the very same cross-shaped church. Why I'm saying this? That's how a colonial mindset of Christianity was inscribed into any local context where it began to take shape. And we follow that even today. So even today, some of the people do not go and sit in certain parts of the church because that's where the untouchable, that's where the Dalits used to sit. So when we talk of mission in a post-colonial sense, it means investigating all these kind of habits that we have developed over a long period of time and seeking and holding it opposite to the gospel and say, does this look right?
Kathy.
I'd just like to follow on from that. I mean, a couple of other examples. So when we were working in Uganda, I remember hearing one of the Ugandan lecturers, it was just a passing comment, it wasn't his main point at all, but the lecture was on what can the African church offer to the world and mission. And one of his passing comments was that when the first Protestant missionaries came to Uganda, which was CMS missionaries from Britain, when the first missionaries came to Uganda, they found nothing of value to take with them back to Europe. I just felt so ashamed and embarrassed. And the journal that Anderson was referring to, it's in the chat, it's Anvil, it's a Journal of Theology of Mission. It's just come out, our latest issue is called Fault Lines in Mission, Reflections on Race and Colonialism. So something that we're grappling with and dealing with in CMS and in our CMS history. One of the articles, a couple of the articles are very much about our history, one by Bishop Emmanuel Igbunu, a Nigerian, who tells the shameful story of how Bishop Crowther was treated. You can read about that. Another one by Angus Crichton, who's been a mission partner in Uganda, also telling the story of when the first missionaries came to Uganda again, and the education that was taught in primary schools was an English education. They completely overlooked traditional healing systems. They overlooked family life structures in that context. Communion, Lambeth said that communion had to be port communion wine, so it had to be ported in thousands of miles from the Kenyan coast. I mean, how ridiculous is that? So these are some of the things that are in our history that we have to acknowledge and we have to get to grips with. And I think the question was, how does this affect our contemporary understandings of evangelism? Well, what does that say to someone if we're undermining their local culture in that way? What does that say about the gospel? What does that say about who God is and how God created us in God's image? I think at the very least, some of the things we have to do is say sorry. We have to say sorry for the things that we've been involved in the past. I mean, even me coming from Aotearoa, New Zealand, I grew up with maps where the world was pink. 2/3 of the world was pink, that was the Commonwealth. I also grew up with the Mercator projection of the map, or the Mercator, I never know if it's Mercator or Mercator, which actually takes 10 degrees off latitude to put Europe in the centre. It's a Eurocentric map. So these are images of the world we have. This is our iconography. So we need to repent of that. We need to say sorry, and we need to listen, and we need to learn. And that impacts our understanding of evangelism hugely, I think.
Yeah.
Would you like to come in, Anderson?
Yeah, no, I think what Kathy, I will just underline that, and just to put this in perspective, I think for those who are interested in theology, I think this is exactly what Paul Tillich calls us to do, the kind of prophetic self-critique of soul searching, not to take everything on face value and simply kind of embrace it because it is under the rubric of Christian mission. Because when I speak for India, I can very well see that the burden of what Kathy referred as the kind of burden of Christianity. We are a small minority. There's only about 2.3% or 3%, but we are still bent on alienating the 88% of people by saying they're all devil's children, they are all demons. So that mindset that somehow not doing what God has called us to do, what Christ has called us to do, to care for one another, we are constantly framing all our brothers and sisters in a particular context, saying, unless you become like this, what early missionaries called Indians as heathens, now Christians are using the same language to kind of frame other people in India, which in a way kind of backfires, and then we end up in a serious persecution of Christians. Instead of living the gospel, we are simply focusing on preaching it and for converting people. And this leads to a whole new area, which we will come back, how early missionaries, at least as far as I know in India is concerned, they were concerned with numbers, how many souls they were able to put it on the book.
Yeah. What I'm hearing from both of your reflections is this idea of kind of stopping and looking and taking a step back and realizing what is happening. I often talk about how once you see these things, you then can't unsee them. Once you see how colonialism has woven its way through our Christianity, you can't then unsee it. I often talk also about my great-grandparents in Nigeria, in a rural area of Nigeria. My great-grandfather was an Anglican priest in the village, and he and my great-grandmother ran a school for Christian wives. And what that meant was women, before they were going to get married, would come to their home, and they would learn how to be good Christian wives. And what that meant was they would learn how to bake cakes, they would learn how to drink tea, they would learn how to kind of have doilies. And that was a story that I grew up with. And it was only when I realized, hang on a minute, why is it that in the middle of rural Nigeria, Christianity was synonymous, even at that point, with Englishness and whiteness? We've got a few questions already coming through, but I'm going to ask one of them before we have a break. If I can find it. There's one of the questions which is around to what extent do you think that the problems we observe in colonial type mission endeavour have also been replicated in the churches of the sending Western nations? For example, imbalance of power, privileged class, alienating practices, which may also have contributed to decline. So how is the kind of that problem of imbalance of power that is experienced globally also replicated within, I guess, Western churches? Any reflections?
Completely. I mean, the C of E has a problem as an establishment church, and it's replicated that all over the world in mission. And I think it's reaping what it sows in terms of what we're experiencing here also. I mean, the way of Jesus is smallness, fragility, vulnerability, being on the edge, and celebrating the local.
Brilliant, thank you.
One of the kind of, I've written about this in the past, it's like how not just the Church of England, but across all the European mission organizations, is that I think even within this small minority, let me speak for India, you have so many different denominations, but they never allowed themselves to work across denominational identities when they were working in these mission fields, so to speak. So even within Church of England, the London Mission Society or CMS Church Mission Society or SPG, which is the Society for Propagation of Gospel, all these different organizations wouldn't kind of necessarily work collaboratively in the mission field, because they were almost like equal conflicting groups back in India. So one of the things, adding to what Kathy said, is that they also exported all these kind of Eurocentric divisions right across, across the world. And therefore, I think whenever I go to, for example, a meeting of the World Council of Churches, yes, there would be a great privilege in saying, oh, we have 360 different churches. But for God's sake, it's all kind of proliferation of the same brand. And because somebody didn't agree with something, then they go and make. And it actually undermines the very premise of coming together again. Mm-hmm. Because I remember, I'm sure Kathy also remembers, when I was also helping for 2010, which is to celebrate the centenary of the mission conference in Edinburgh, which was held in 1910. The deliberations and the questions that we were engaging with is like how we are going to accommodate the diversity of the mission organizations who all agree to work in small pockets back in the mission fields. So one of the byproducts of this kind of mission preoccupation or mission organization preoccupation is their own identity, which was enforced upon those contexts where missionaries were working. So the same could be said, I also again work across the American missionaries who came and worked in South India. So you would have the Reformed tradition as well as the kind of more charismatic congregational tradition. So today, this is not something a thing of the past, but this is something, a lived experience of Christians in places like South India. And I've been working in, again, as Chinny said, I've been working in Nigeria and Ghana as well. The same identities of Anglican, Catholic, Presbyterian, Church of Scotland, Free Church of Scotland, all these identities are overlapped into our own local differences, and we are conflicted with that. And this is another burden of the mission colonial heritage.
Thank you so much. So we are halfway through our time together. We have enough questions to probably get us through the next 3 hours, but we're going to take a 2-minute break now. But if you would like to add questions, then please do send them to me in the chat or write them in the open chat box. I'm going to turn my video off for 2 minutes and turn it back on when our break is over. Thank you. So our next question, I will start with Kathy. We touched a little bit on this, but perhaps if we could expand a bit further. How does Britain's imperial past, rooted in the atrocities of empire, impact contemporary understandings of mission and evangelism?
I think we have touched on this. I mean, I think it, I guess it buys into or plays into understandings of white superiority and white privilege, which has definitely been a part of mission. But I think I should just say it's easy to look back on mission and criticize the missionaries and critique them, isn't it? It's very easy with hindsight. And just want to point out that it's ambiguous. I mean, people will say, I have friends in the continent of Africa who will say the missionaries, were the best friends we ever had. And there was many things about the gospel that challenged aspects of local culture that aren't helpful and that aren't good, as should happen everywhere in the world. But there certainly were aspects that were not helpful. And I mean, we can think of many examples of it: the slave trade, apartheid, how Indigenous peoples were treated. In my own country of Aotearoa, New Zealand, we used to talk about the Maori wars as if somehow it was the Maori's fault. We now at least talk about the land wars. We know that the British attacked the Maori on Sundays because they knew that they would be at church. So they were easy targets. So there's a lot about our history, I think, that we need to own and remember and say sorry for. We need to own the fact that sometimes we've colluded in this, that we have been paternalistic, that we haven't understood local cultures or listened to local cultures to the extent that we should. And so all this has just huge implications in how we understand who we are and what we think mission is about, because we still seem to think it's from the West to the rest, as if we have something. Well, in a sense, we do have something to take, but we also have a lot to receive. So we need to think much more in terms of mutuality and hospitality and vulnerability and receptivity, and also imagination. I think a very good article, they're all good articles in that Anvil, but Lusa and Sangarangoy's article, he's the intercultural advisor in the Diocese of Leicester and originally from Congo. His article about imagination, I think, is really powerful, and how imagination can be a form of resistance and resilience, and how it can also help us engage in a new future, to reimagine how a future could be. So I think I'll stop there and hand over to Anderson. Those are just a few thoughts. Maybe we can have a bit more of a conversation on this one, because there's so much to say.
I wonder, Anderson, if you could focus in on that, the atrocities of empire, and in what ways, if at all, was the church and therefore mission complicit in some of those atrocities?
Yes, I think it's probably I would frame it as Kathy framed it. I think the relationship between missionaries and the Christianity that they practiced and the empire is a very ambiguous, contentious relationship. Not all missionaries wholeheartedly supported the powers, the colonial empire, but some institutional figures did demand complete obedience to the colonial power. Just to kind of give you a more dramatic example of how missionaries were caught up in this kind of situation is, particularly in the early 20th century, this is between 1920 1930s, when there was this huge famine that was sweeping parts of India. And many missionaries were trying to respond to that and try and see how they can help this famished population. But the colonial British Empire basically enforced that it cannot affect any stopping of importing of resources from the colony to Britain. And very famously, Winston Churchill at that time kind of simply ignored. It could have been the colonial powers at that point in time could have very easily stepped in to stop the kind of famine that was sweeping much of India. But they turned a blind eye, but they insisted on producing cotton that should be sent to the mills of in Lancashire, where I'm placed, which basically led to Gandhi leading this non-cooperation movement and basically stopping the cotton production. The church was kind of caught up in between these struggles. So this is just a much more familiar impact of the church. But if you go back before that, not just the British Empire, but the Portuguese, the French, and the Dutch, they were all hundreds and thousands of people who have been massacred when they refused to take orders. Or even within Christianity, within the tension between the Protestant churches and the Syrian Orthodox Church and the Catholic Church, where the Catholic colonial powers basically destroyed the Syrian Thomas Church, which was there for nearly 14 centuries before the Catholic powers came. So the atrocities has been there for a long, long time. But the question that I would turn to is like focusing on how the missionaries helped certain elements, but at the same time, they were also forced to collude with the colonial powers in many cases. So up until, say, 1930s or 1940s, most of the churches in the Indian context were all part of the colonial establishment. Most of the churches were always built within a fort. You can see that even today when you travel forts across India, churches are always built within those forts. And just to kind of use the same metaphor, my biggest moment of realization came when I was standing in Ghana, in Cape Coast, in Elmina Castle, where the slaves were kept in this dungeon, waiting to be shipped right across the Atlantic. And right above that sits the Anglican chapel, where people worshipped every Sunday with the slaves kind of literally, wallowing in their own excrement. So that is the image for me that still lingers on, the power, the collaboration between the institutional establishment of the church and the colonial empire. And very sadly, I need to say this, many of the churches in all these places, whether Church of South India or the church in Nigeria, church in Ghana, or church in South Africa, the institutional church somehow is replicating the same things even today. It might be all black people, brown people. You may not see any white people there. But what has become is that we have become captives of the same institutional trappings. And that is because we are not in kind of examining and critiquing our own practices, which we inherited. And that's where I think it's very important, as Kathy pointed out, a mission, as we understand today, should be something that demands us that we look at our own practices, whether not just in the 18th century and 19th century, but actually question now how we are reliving the same colonial past in our own way.
Brilliant.
I think what Anderson was saying there about the institutional trappings and replicating that is exactly what Emmanuel Katongole was saying. Same script, different actors. And it perhaps comes out of, I think it's Homi Bhabha's theory, isn't it, about mimicry, mimicking the oppressor in a sense. Yeah. And I mean, I think this question about empire is that mission has been, and to a certain extent still is, accompanied by power. So it's been these Western nations that are powerful nations that have taken, you know, for better or for worse, wittingly or unwittingly, taken all that power with them and been seen as Western and powerful. So, you know, they used to say in China back in the beginning of the 20th century, one more Christian, one less Chinese. I mean, how tragic is that? Instead, they should have been coming more fully who they're made to be in Christ, more Chinese in Christ, not less Chinese. So we've had this really ambiguous, unfortunate relationship with power, which hopefully is gradually changing, because as Western powers maybe, hopefully lose some of that influence and wealth and prestige and status, then mission can become a little bit detached from that. And of course, we see with missionaries in the majority world. So, you know, even though Anderson's just said there are these institutional trappings, for many, they're free from that. They don't have the backing of power and this ambiguous relationship and this relationship of collusion with power. So, you know, mission and weakness is really what we're wanting.
There's so much that we could talk about in terms of that collusion with power. I'm sure you see that there are lots of examples in the Western church, we can point to it in the US, in the UK, where the church is synonymous with power, or the church itself seeks power and doesn't want to give away power. But we won't talk about that. I will go to some of the questions that have come in. I'm going to join two together for Anderson here. So someone is asking, how can Dalit pastors carry the mission of God in the caste-poisoned church? Dalit pastors have been discriminated against in the church. Their commitment for God as a living element been demeaned by the caste system. They resist the caste system instead of doing mission. So how can we carry the mission of God? And there's a kind of associate question from Doug, who asks, could Anderson reflect further with us on the church whose shape facilitated seating by caste? Did the early missionaries see that as being sensitive to local culture? When cultures meet around the gospel, what are the ways in which we discern good and bad enculturation? So reflect on those two questions in any way you would like.
Well, let me start with the caste question. I think the caste question is again a very complex question. Caste system is itself something that lends itself. No religion is immune to caste system in India. So is the case with Christianity. And for a long time, missionaries took a much more, I think they took a kind of three principles. Either you accommodate, you reject, or you have a compromised position. You kind of, you accommodate to a certain extent, but then you say, okay, beyond that, you know, interdining, intermarrying, and all of those things cannot be allowed. You keep your caste, as long as you leave it outside the church, that's okay. Some would say even that is completely rejected. And there were some missionaries who would say, well, let's take a much more pragmatic approach. If people are not becoming Christians, therefore we need to try and balance that. The challenge with caste system is that it means different things to different people, and it allows itself to be interpreted by those who are in power and inflict kind of their own worldview onto it. What is interesting is that I reflect from my point as a Dalit Christian. So these days I've been reflecting more on this because I don't remember a time when I was told that I could do whatever I want to. I was always told that what I can't do. So if I want to study maths, I would say, oh, you're not intellectually capable of doing that. Because even in schools, way back when I was in schools, I was always made to sit in a different place. I was made to sit in the last row, even though I wanted to sit very close to the board so that I can see. But I never knew these things, why it was happening around me. But now I reflect back because it was the fact that I am who I am. And this was very much part of my Christian upbringing. But what was given to me, my dad, my mom, who also experienced the same kind of, so to speak, the untouchability and exclusion, what they gave to us is that Christ has embraced us, Christ has given us a new life, and that's what should be the focus. So as a Dalit, yes, I've been treated pretty badly. Yes, I've been treated rather shabbily. I have experienced exclusion and oppression in all sorts of forms. But for me, the hope is that I can only bring about change if I preach again the gospel of reconciliation, that Christ is able to sacrifice himself for the sake that we can have life. If I'm going to simply perpetuate the same kind of oppression that I experience, then there won't be any end to that cycle of oppression. Therefore, my preoccupation, and many Dalit Christians, is that yes, you have been very bad to us, during the caste system, but we are, as Christians, we are moving in a different direction. We are inviting all of us to experience liberation and freedom and fullness of life that is possible in Christ. And that's the way that many Dalit Christians and Dalit pastors try and work. But of course, it's not that easy, because I can again speak for my own church, that is Church of South India. You have, again, it's the question of power. Many Dalit pastors, Dalit leaders come into positions of power and they start replicating the same thing. And power corrupts. So it's almost kind of one who has been oppressed becomes the oppressor in this case. So you basically do the same thing, and which is self-defeating in many ways. So, and that's because that's the power of the caste system, because almost like those bishops from Dalit background who become bishops, and they become like the high caste oppressors in many ways, who start practicing caste within the church. And that's the vicious cycle that Christianity has to deal with in India, for example. And the same thing to a certain extent can be said in the Sri Lankan context, in the Pakistani context, and also in the Bangladeshi context, where all caste is so deeply ingrained into our psyche. The same situation is in Pakistan. Many of the Christians experience persecution in Pakistan, not simply because of their Christian faith, of course that is one of the factors, but majority of Christians in Pakistan are from the previous untouchable communities. So that is another dynamics, and you can give the same example in Sri Lankan context, where the tension between Tamils and Sinhalese also has a caste variation. So caste is a very complex issue, and I don't blame the missionaries for not getting their head around that. But I think even today's context, I think we have a huge responsibility, and that's why I take a much more radical view of, unless we get rid of this caste worldview and caste mindset, none of us, whether you are Hindu, Muslim, Christian, or anybody, none of us can have fullness of life.
Thank you. There's so much to unpack there. I just reflecting on what you're saying and thinking that it would be amazing to have conversations between Black Western Christians and Dalits to understand that kind of that sense of being a history of being untouchable, but how do you move forward together in that? You mentioned there about reconciliation, and there is a question here that I'll open up to Kathy first. How can viewing mission as reconciliation affect our approach to mission and evangelism in today's culture in multicultural Great Britain? And linked to that is another question, which came in earlier. How do we create a culture through our mission during these troubled times between races, especially through the Black Lives Matter movement, and try to understand our past to create a better future with God's mission? So a little bit about current context and multiculturalism, different races. Kathy.
Thanks. Well, just about the Black Lives Matter movement and how do we engage with that and live in these times. I just encourage you to look at the Anvil Journal, because Lusa and others, Harvey Kwiyani, Shamil Anderson has a piece in that journal deal with some of those questions. And I think as a white person, I just feel like we have to be quiet. Which of course I'm not doing today, but I feel like as white people, we need to listen and learn. We need to acknowledge white fragility. And we need to work really hard at trying to imagine, to put ourselves in someone else's shoes and reimagine the world in a different way. Lisa talks about the movie Black Panther and some novels where Britain is run by Black people, by Africans. How would that feel? Those little Oxford University Press introductions, one on post-colonialism, starts off by saying, have you ever been a minority, the only person in a room of people of different colour or different sexuality or whatever, and how do you feel? For most white people, that's not a common experience. Reconciliation is a theme and mission that people write about, such as Schreiter. I think, again, absolutely essential. Reconciliation on whose terms? How do we practice that? What does that look like for people from very different contexts and cultures? I think it's a great theme, but I think it's also quite complex. And I guess I've been learning, kind of the older I've got, that the less I know and the more really I need to learn. Anderson, how would you respond?
Yeah, no, I think I would, from a missional perspective, I would say kind of repentance is very important. So I think there was a comment, it's not so much about navel gazing, but being acutely aware of our past is very important. Otherwise, I think very often one of my teachers used to say, to take one step forward, you need to take one step backwards. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, we won't. And we shouldn't obsess about it, but at the same time, we need to be acutely aware of it. But at the same time, we also need to think of reparations, not necessarily in terms of financial reparations, but to mend our ways, to change. There is no, I think institutionally what we are trying to do is that we are trying to tinker here and there. The fundamental question is that what kind of color my God is? Are we still imagining a white God sitting with a long beard up in the sky and dictating all of this? I think this goes to the heart of our very fundamental theological preconceptions. So if we are still, our mission might be very liberal, very outwardly and kind of transformational, but where does this understanding stem from? And I think I would probably put it more of a theological reparation. In a sense, we need to be consciously withdrawing those theological paradigms that has inflicted so much pain on people, mm-hmm. which enforced acceptance of servitude, slavery, mm-hmm. and all these kind of things. We need to consciously remove those kind of theological paradigms, which allows us to work on reconciliation. So repentance, reparation, and reconciliation is very mm-hmm. important. I think this is where I think as mission, as Kathy pointed out, I think we all need to work together. I cannot achieve this on my own. This is not an issue between white people and brown people, black people. I think we all need to work together as God's children, trying to bring this image of God that has been fragmented or broken, or this body of Christ that has become wounded. We all need to work together. Otherwise, this won't work. We won't be able to bring the kingdom of God or the rule of Christ, as I would like to argue. It's a collaborative, collective effort. And what that means is that, what I said is that unless we put our bodies, which is from a very safe environment, into the places where every moment is a life and death question, we won't be able to experience that. We need to get into the skin of other people. And mission, for me, I think this is where, I think that's what Jesus Christ did. He became, one of us. God became one of us. Unless each one of us who's participating here becomes a person of other, we are very good in othering people. Unless we experience that process of othering, we won't be able to do God's mission.
Thank you, Anderson. My heart is singing because a lot of what you've just said is in my forthcoming book coming out in May, called God is Not a White Man and Other Revelations. We have come to the end of our time together. That was a fascinating conversation that we could continue for hours and hours, I'm sure. But I want to say thank you to Dr. Kathy Ross, Reverend Dr. Anderson Jeremiah, and also Rachel Murray for BSL interpretation. And thank you to Dr. Eve Parker and Common Awards for putting this together. So thank you all for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you.